Well, good Sunday evening here in August of 2025, August 24th to be exact, with Grafton Tanner in the studio as promised, and our very own Will here to talk tonight. Well, hopefully it will be a smorgasbord of digressions, but there will be a few central topics as well. Primarily, we'll be discussing the politics of nostalgia, our upcoming course from the Acid Horizon Research Commons. And so maybe I'll just do a little bit of promo before we get started. Actually, Grafton just stepped into the studio, so we've had no preliminary conversation. So you're going to hear our warm-up right now. You're getting like the whole green room experience here. But just a little promo right at the top. Starting next month, September 10th to be exact, Grafton will be teaching with our new para-academic teaching platform, the Acid Horizon Research Commons, the politics of nostalgia, basically Grafton's wheelhouse. He'll be covering his, aspects of his work on nostalgia, not to mention various theorists who have discussed nostalgia, namely folks like Mark Fisher, the concept of hauntology and everything else. And we just want to say also that enrollment is now live. So while we are discussing here tonight, and as you get more and more interested in the things that we're talking about, you'll see there is a banner at the bottom of the screen. You just direct yourself to the Acid Horizon Podcast website, acidhorizonpodcast.com. There's a link up there, AHRC for Acid Horizon Research Commons, and there should be a sublink for the fall 2025 offerings, which include Grafton's course and one more course, Laruelle's Non-Philosophy, Rebellious Postulates with Jeremy R. Smith. We will eventually have Jeremy on the live stream as well. And the two courses that we offered, one is kind of a cultural criticism-centered course with a variety of theorists, not focusing on one central theorist, giving you a set of tools that includes theory, but also aspects of cultural theory, social theory, and so forth. And then we wanted to do something a little bit more focused on a figure who pops up now and again on the podcast, which of course is Francois Laruelle. And there are very few people who are more apt to deliver that course to you than our friend Jeremy R. Smith. So we have two people that we trust, that we know, that have been in our corner. Grafton has certainly earned his stripes with us. He has stood with us in solidarity when it has mattered most. And we want to thank him for joining us here today and being part of this live launch of the Acid Horizon Research Commons. So without further ado, Grafton, welcome. How have you been?
I've been pretty good. I've been trying to stay out of this hot weather down here in Georgia. It's just, I have like reverse seasonal depression. I try not to leave the house when it's above like 90 degrees.
Oh, man, that's exactly how it was when I lived in San Gabriel Valley in California. And right now, I think it's 75 degrees, but I got my camo hoodie on. Like, this is really wishful thinking. So I'm living in October right now, folks. We also have Will in the studio. Will, how you doing?
It's not hoodie weather yet. As much as like my emo sensibilities want it to be, it is still linen shirt weather, which is disgusting and sweaty. But I'm excited to talk about nostalgia, as it's like something that I think comes up a lot in contemporary cultural theory. In fact, cultural theory almost seems stuck and nostalgic in itself. And maybe we can talk about what happened to cultural theory in the 90s and early 2000s and why certain thinkers come across as like fundamentally nostalgic. But yeah, I'm excited to see what's in store here.
Well, maybe a way to kick this off before we get too far into the weeds. There's a video going around right now. And of course, I put out my soapbox about it on Twitter. And I think even maybe Blue Sky, I don't know, maybe Twitter. The kind of quote tweet that we're talking about here is totally a Twitter quote tweet. But anyway, Grafton, I don't know if you saw this video, but I'd like for you to watch it, and maybe we can use this as a jumping off point for our conversation here today. So
cool.
Here we go.
Ladies miss you, right?
Let me guess. No one even talks face to face anymore.
Here? We're out till the streetlights come on. You should stay. The world feels real here.
Oh, did we lose the video? Wait.
Friday night diners, cruising down Burnside in your friend's Camaro. What's 2025 got?
Yo, what are you even doing in 2025? Out there, it looks like everyone's glued to their phones, chasing nothing. No block parties, no Friday night hangout.
Do you even remember what it's like to really be here? Out here, time doesn't race, it breathes. And if you've forgotten that, then maybe that's why the 80s are calling you back.
Yo, you coming or what?
You don't get it. The 80s wasn't just about neon lights or mixtapes. It was about being here, actually being with people. No screens in your face, no noise from the future. Just the moment. The 80s miss you. We all do. Maybe it's time you came back.
All right. Grafton, have you seen that?
I did see that. I saw it a couple days ago, scrolling through Instagram Reels, and I was like, there it is. Once again.
I mean, basically that slop is Stranger Things if you took out all the horror elements and then you just put in a bunch of bullies telling you to kill yourself. I mean, that's what it looks like to me. So when I saw that, I mean, it is incredible too, the kind of AI realism era that we're now slowly lurching into. But I don't know, maybe we can get some of your initial comments. One of the first questions that I had for you regarding nostalgia was like, look, you have been writing on the topic of nostalgia for years, but in 2025, it feels like we're in a moment where it saturates everything: politics, media, the marketplace. Make America great again. One of the most successful political campaigns of our millennium has been based on nostalgia. But what do you think has changed about nostalgia since you first started writing about it?
Man, it keeps coming back, doesn't it? I mean, I was saying because I agree. I mean, it's like every cultural moment seems like the right time for nostalgia to make a reappearance. I mean, I was saying this 10 years ago in 2015. I was writing my first book, which was a book about the music genre vaporwave. And I was writing back then, I was like, hey, it seems very strange that like politically, culturally, there seems to be a lot of what at the time seemed like, nostalgic content or messaging that attempted to press a nostalgic button in like the collective psyche or something. So I feel like I've been saying it for a long time. And what's changed? Well, AI is what's changed. I mean, I think that we have now a tool that can pretty credibly recycle images and sights and sounds of the past in a new way to channel old nostalgias. And about 10 years ago or so, we were kind of like maybe at the peak or maybe kind of maybe the downturn of like the 1980s nostalgia. And it's been very Y2K centric ever since. And then I see this video the same day that I hear Doja Cat's new single, which is actually kind of a fire single, but it's heavily 80s, coded. And I'm kind of like, here we go, back around. You can't kill the 80s.
I mean, seriously. I mean, is the new track, what is it? Is it like Simmons drum pad heavy sort of thing, or?
A little bit, yeah. And her music video, she's kind of got this like 80s blowout going on, and it's actually I'm a sucker for it. It's actually a pretty cool song, and and she's kind of doing it in kind of a campy way. But yeah, the 1980s cannot go away. They refuse to.
I remember last summer. Remember when that song $1 Million Baby came out?
Which one? I don't know if I know that one.
Will, do you know that song? What's the guy's name? See, I'm not that hip anymore. So I hold on. Tommy Richmond.
Yeah. Okay, yeah.
One of the appeals of that song is that it was multi-generational, right? I mean, of course, it has the 808 drum track and everything, and it has a little bit of the kind of, and that song is interesting because it truly is hauntological in the sense in that all of the sort of color palette from the 70s, 80s, even the 90s and early aughts are all kind of blended together. And it seems like part of the game was doing it in a way that would touch all generations. And one of the sort of positive reviews of that song is it caught on with like Gen Xers and Zoomers and maybe even some Gen Alpha kids too. But yeah, I think this is one of the areas where I think Mark Fisher was correct to a certain extent. I do think the new is being produced in some vectors of art and music, but I would say predominantly in the mainstream, this is the sort of general palette that we're working with, somewhere between the 70s and the early aughts, and just some permutation thereof.
Yeah, that song really, you're exactly right. It's funny how easily I forgot it once it stopped trending. You mentioned the name and I was like, what are you talking? Yeah, okay. It's because it permeated my, social media feed for a long time. But yeah, I mean, it really is like it sounds like AI made it. Like if you were to prompt it with like make something that hits the major cultural touchstones of, like you said, the 70s through the very early 2000s, what would it sound like, And I saw a video of him like trying to do it live. And maybe people were being too hard on him, but like it didn't translate at all.
Well, there was also like two major releases on Spotify. There was like the regular mastered version, and then the other version sounded like it was run through a VHS machine, right? Like a VCR.
Yes.
And I mean, look, I mean that's an age-old studio technique. You just want to like blow out your signal if you want it to make it sound more analog. Run it through an old tape machine, turn up the faders, it gets the bass all woofy and everything like that. And he let it run like that. And I think the numbers are higher on the VCR version.
I believe it. I believe it.
Wow. But yeah, so anyway, talking about nostalgia. So, I want to first, make sure that the message gets out about the course. I want to thank you again for being a kind of guinea pig for us in launching this venture, which is, we've been going for 5+ years now and expanding our platform. And, there's always a question of viability. We want to grow, expand, do new things, not necessarily repeat a certain formula. And one of the things that I wanted to do for a while is get people engaged. People are always asking how they can help get engaged and so forth. And we've now hit a threshold in our society, well, in the United States, all of us in this room right now are from the US, where the humanities, academia in general, and the arts, and just funding in general is drying up. It's gone. The new Trump policies and what have you. It's going to be harder to become a graduate student. They're going to give you less in terms of public loans. So that means you'll have to go to these predatory private loan folks. And, that's not good. And people who've been on like loan forgiveness programs, they're having trouble and things like that. And that's always been part of the sort of rhythm of and lifeline of a grad student who then, either becomes a professor or lecturer at a community college or elsewhere, or just goes on, to professional life. But it seems like that track is being troubled right now. And one of the things that I thought that we should do was, which is quite possible, is develop a platform where we resource teachers, professors, notable scholars, writers, and so forth, and have them do classes online. And then I would like to get to the point where we get the kind of license that would allow us to offer an equivalency for a master's degree. And what that would do, the thing that would allow potential prospective students to do is, if they wanted to do a PhD program, they could potentially bypass a step that's now seen as important, which is if you went to undergrad and you took a gap year, or you took a job, or you were in a band for 10 years like I was, and then you go back to school, well, they're not going to accept you in a PhD program right away. They want to see that you've been doing some kind of work. And so we wanted to create a place where that kind of work could happen. And it could happen in a way where the courses were real, they were relevant, they attended to the interests of our general listenership and viewership. And when you reached out to me, Grafton is a kind of exemplar among many, who is like, look, I work in the university system. I'm kind of looking for work right now in conjunction with that. You had asked me, I think, like, do you know of any sort of publishing or editing jobs? And then I thought you would be perfect for this venture because of the kind of work that you did. And not only that, when we took over Zero and Repeater back in the day, you were one of the first authors that we brought back. So you must pass the Grafton Tanner gate in the Acid Horizon world before you continue.
No
Anyway,
gate. No gate.
Yeah, no gate. But anyway, I thought that the whole politics of nostalgia thing was like going to be like a nice sort of cornerstone for the first leg, or the first kind of like small building, the atrium of the Acid Horizon Research Commons. And I would like you to talk about that a little bit. If somebody enrolls in your course, they're going to get 4 sessions over a period of weeks. Like what kind of things can they expect in that course?
Oh man. So what I want to do in the course, and I've kind of got it charted out in the syllabus, and thank you, Craig, for shaping up the syllabus and making it look really cool and aesthetically pleasing. And but yeah, so what I want to do in this class is contextualize nostalgia a little bit by charting its history. Because I do think that like this is something, I mean, those of us living right now, especially as you say in the United States, are pretty well aware with the I guess the examples of nostalgia in politics and in culture. And what I want to do is kind of trace it back a little bit and go like, where does this come? Where did this come from? And try to do our best in a couple of weeks just to chart that through line from, because the thing about nostalgia is it's a relatively recent phenomenon. It's a relatively recent idea in the modern world. And so we have a starting point where when the word first shows up, and we're just going to kind of go through and look at, in particular, the ways in which kind of like the modern nation state in the West, if you will, has been really suspicious of nostalgia, which kind of seems strange when you think about like most of the political and cultural institutions in the United States today, in the Western world today, are very much okay with nostalgia, and they're totally fine with releasing messaging that is inflected with nostalgia. As you say, Donald Trump's a big example of this, and as well as companies like Disney, et cetera. And so I want to try to bridge this paradox a little bit about what happened with nostalgia, how it went from this this idea that scared a lot of the the folks who believed in the civilizing process and in progress, how it went from scaring them to then being something that maybe was okay to give the public in certain doses. And so that's what we're looking at here. We're gonna look at some examples. We've got some reading. I can show you some light reading, some of the books that we'll be touching on. So yeah.
Good. Before I turn it over to Will to ask the next question, if you're listening to us right now and you have questions, you can see they have the, what do we call this thing at the bottom, where it aggregates all the comments in the corner here. If you have a question, a comment or something, feel free to chime in and we will highlight some of them and perhaps even react to some of them as well. Will, go ahead.
I'm going to ask like a super vague and general question just to attempt to sort of catch a vibe through the answer. Like, how do you understand cultural theory's relation to nostalgia?
When you say cultural theory, do you mean like cultural studies?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, some of my first, I guess, like introductions to the idea of, or like, I guess my first exposures to studying nostalgia came through cultural theory. And so like I was very young, probably too young when I first read folks like Foucault, but also Frederick Jameson. And then of course, later on, Mark Fisher. And so to me, I always felt like that some like folks like Jameson and Fisher were touching on something that I think was pretty important, especially like, I'm trying to think of the Jameson article, the one where he talks about nostalgia films, which was really weird to read that in like I think I read it like in 2012 or 2013, when some of these films were very much being distributed. And we had like a Star Wars reboot, and he was writing about Star Wars long before I had read that article. And so I think it was striking that some of the things he was saying was still pretty pretty relevant to the time in which I was reading them. And I do think, if maybe this is kind of getting at what you're asking, but I do think that we as cultural theorists sometimes repeat. I know I do, and it's weird to be a nostalgia scholar, critic type person, and to kind of use the same examples, and yet those same examples keep showing up in the culture. So I've been writing about Star Wars for 10 plus years now, as a, not just like the movies themselves, but kind of like as a force or something that we can analyze to maybe find out a little bit more about, what's going on in the culture. And I keep coming back to that example over and over again because it keeps kind of showing up. And so just when I think that maybe that's going to be it, like we're not going to have to deal with those examples anymore because people are going to be sick of them, or maybe they're going to stop greenlighting those movies, they keep showing up. So is that kind of what you're getting at with your question? Is
I'm reminded of when I was a child. I don't know why this line has stuck with me. When I was a kid, I owned the box set of the original trilogy of the Star Wars, the one that's like mangled with all the keyframed in new species of monster, and they make Hayden Christensen, I think, or something, the stand-in for the ghost of Anakin Skywalker or whatever. There's a documentary that follows it, the third film, and in that, one of the producers or someone, a tech hand or something, says it's hard to remember a time before Star Wars. And they say in the United States, before Star Wars, America was bogged down in, the example that they gave was the Vietnam War. America was bogged down in Vietnam. And after that, there's Star Wars. And it's kind of interesting to me that Star Wars seems to be the place where we return to. And in fact, the 80s seem to be the place where we return to. There's this hard limit in the United States of cultural recycling, at least according to like Mark Fisher, of like 80s music, especially his polemic against the Arctic Monkeys, a band that he has a unique distaste for. Which I don't think I've fully ever understood. I do think Arctic Monkeys they're not great, but they are quite a diversion away from standard Britpop. But it seems like in the United States there is a kind of hard limit on American nostalgia. Critical theory lords. I don't consider myself in the realm of critical theory. Star Wars is a rip of Frank Herbert in some ways, but that's also why it was so strange in its original conception. Like George Lucas's original idea of what Star Wars would look like is totally foreign to what the heroes, to the sort of clean hero's journey that we get. I was wondering if like maybe there is a kind of there are social forces that enable a kind of politic, like Bernard Stiegler says we need a particular politics of memory, right? At the end of the first volume of Technics and Time, right? We don't have a politics of memory. I don't know if that's true. There certainly is like the need for a kind of politics of a certain kind of memory. But I'm wondering, why is it that certain periods, like the 80s in particular, which tends to be the joke, at least colloquially, is that Gen X is this forgotten generation, right? That they're not really in government. They don't really hold a kind of esteemed place in discourse. Millennials have, their relation to the housing market, right? They mark a kind of point in the transition from, a mortgage class to a renter class. Gen Alpha has a technological disposition in relation to Gen Z, and then of course Gen Z has a sort of cultural position. But do you think that even though colloquially, like there's the Zillennial Star Wars subgeneration, do you think that there's a kind of what might be the reason that you keep returning to Star Wars? Because I'm seeing like a stopgap before it, right? No one can remember a time before Star Wars. Of course we can, right? We're living in the trauma of the Vietnam War still, in some ways, and it's still affecting like American policymaking and so on. But do you think that there's a reason why that particular franchise has the claim that it does, or does it just make great toys? Is the lightsaber just a really good toy?
It is pretty cool. Lightsaber, it is pretty cool, but it's got it has the benefit of having enormous financial backing behind it, especially now in the last like 20 years or so. Even before Disney bought Lucasfilm, you're talking about a film that was highly successful and created an early trilogy at a time when like the idea of like the Hollywood the invention of like the Hollywood blockbuster that comes out, after a period of like actually pretty cool, like new Hollywood cinema, like movies like, oh gosh, like what was the production companies? BBS, is that what it was that had a lot of a film person can check me on this, but the end of cool new Hollywood and the beginning of like the blockbuster, which a lot of that divide has been challenged by scholars over the years, including some of the folks that ran the We Are the Mutants website and wrote the We Are the Mutants book that came out in Repeater a couple years ago. Anyway, but you're talking about like a very successful trilogy that was successful because it relied on advertising and like merchandising tie-ins and this like synergy across all platforms. That then gets rebooted a couple years later and then has never really gone away. So I like to think of it as like you do have, obviously fandom is a part of this. You do have people who are huge fans of Star Wars. We also have to remember that like this is kind of a cash cow for these producers, and even though they themselves, and there's interviews with folks like Kathleen Kennedy who have said this on record, they themselves have kind of got a bit of a Star Wars fatigue. And of course, you can do a cursory search on TikTok or YouTube and come across a number of different Star Wars podcasts where all they do is just critique and criticize quite negatively the newer movies. And so it doesn't really matter that there's a fatigue as long as these movies keep getting greenlit. And they keep getting greenlit because they have so much money behind them. And I used to sometimes think like, if they ever quit making so much money, would they quit making the movies? But the thing is like, I'm not totally sure if even the movies themselves are I don't even know if that's really what's making them the most money. Yeah, I mean, I do think that we're talking about, again, I like to think of these movies as kind of like technologies or funnels through which we can, certain types of messaging flows through really smoothly. A lot of neoliberal, a lot of like, pull yourselves up by your bootstraps kind of rhetoric, the magic of technology, and certainly some touches of nostalgia in there too. They're funnels, and they're successful. And that's why they don't seem to go away.
Yeah, a huge part of nostalgia comes from the promise that these ages once carried, right? That I think Craig disappeared for a second, so we'll bring him back. But Craig is sort of, I think, better at this because he understands Mark Fisher's use of hauntology better than I do. I have kind of a more benign reading of it, but like part of it is like a memory of the future, right? Like we had different futures in this sort of political memory, and I'm wondering if maybe it plays as much into things that were once like a lot of reactionary politics comes from betrayed promises, right? The especially when it comes to parliamentary politics, right? Electoral politics is, in the 90s you were promised X, Y, and Z from this political trajectory, and now that's been torn from you, right? A lot of the world of 2016 presidential politics and the world of 2024 presidential politics are distinct, right? Because the entrance of the tech right and all of this stuff. But the sort of, what role does the future play in nostalgia, if at all, or if it's a purely back-looking frame of mind? You know, I think of certain readings of techno-pessimism, right, that have a kind of nostalgic element to them. You know, even some of the greatest, you know, philosophical trajectories of the 20th century have a kind of nostalgic element. I think of like, you know, for better or for worse, you know, the reading of like Heidegger's analysis of the shoes, right? Or, you know, Jacques Ellul's reading of techne as foreclosing on a kind of relation to the world. What role does sort of the future and the promise of technology and the promise of a politics to come sort of play in nostalgia?
Look, my own writing has elements of nostalgia in it. If you don't get that, then I mean, you know, it's like it's there. I mean, look, the way I say, okay, let's I'll refer back to the video that Craig showed earlier. So the AI video of the you know, the people who are in the 80s or whatever, they dress like the 80s. Come back here, you know, you ought to be nostalgic for this time, you know. That video it makes an argument. It has a certain framing to it. The way that it frames that decade is as this period of freedom, where there's real connection, there's real communication with other people. The problems of today, which are highly, you know, influenced by digital technologies and whatever, and people not being able to agree on anything because they're all shouting into the void on Twitter or whatever. This video, just like so many kinds of nostalgic arguments, makes this kind of framing. If you were here, if you would come join us in the past, you wouldn't have to deal with those problems anymore. You would live a freer life. You know, and so I agree with you. I do think that there's a subtext here in videos like that, that are essentially saying that, you know, there has been a bit of a betrayal, you know, like it wasn't so much that maybe like the 1980s promised the future, but it did promise like a present that we could all live in, and in a way in which we can all, you know, connect with others in a meaningful kind of way. And somehow we've lost that, you know, and so for some of these nostalgic arguments, the way to the future is by making a return. And I've written about this, you know, a million times with the Make America Great Again slogan. You know, the problem with that slogan isn't necessarily that it is nostalgic. It's that it makes a certain argument about moving forward. The only way to fix things is to make this return. And of course, you know, it's like, who doesn't want real connection and real communication? Who doesn't want block parties and being able to go see movies with your friends? Sounds great. Live free, die young, you know, whatever. But it's that there's all of these like these accessory arguments that comes with the argument of a return to the 1980s. So yeah, I hope that kind of answers your question there.
That's great. You know, we're talking about nostalgia. And I know that this conversation, like, we'll ask one more question and then it will be a half hour from now. But there is something that I wanted to talk to you about tonight that we talked about in the past. And it's regarding your more recent research projects, which include cults and exorcism. And we had discussed that. I don't know if you're prepared to discuss, like, as I understood it, you were writing a book on it, or doing research for it. Could you tell us a little bit about that? And does that connect to any of the nostalgia stuff that you've written about in the past?
I think the word nostalgia shows up in that manuscript one time.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it does. It does. It's been, you know, I wanted to do something new. And so, and I'll make a statement about this later on, but that project has it's just been beaten up every way possible. I've beaten up on it, but also like it's a whole situation. It's being published in a non-ideal way. I'll leave it at that, and more information to come about that. But if you're interested in finding out more about it, certainly people can email me and I can tell them more. But
well, one of the things that I wanted to make a connection with is, I mean, when we think about Make America Great Again, and I mean, even though she's really not fully on that team anymore. Somebody like Marjorie Taylor Greene, and just that sort of genre of politician. There's a way in which we can think of many different kinds of politics as ideological cults. And it seems to me that there would be a very strong connection between nostalgia and cults in that sense. And I was wondering if you had any insights of that sort. Based on what's unfolding in the U.S. today.
Yeah, I do dig a little bit into like the rhetoric of like ideological brainwashing or ideological cult, and the way that we kind of use those words to describe political groups, the cult of the far right. It seems like it's a cult. I mean, it's a bunch of people who believe in things that why would you believe in them? How could, and I'll tell you, I got started thinking about, so basically it's a book project. It's essentially a history of exorcism and possession ideas, or exorcism and possession rhetoric since World War II. I kind of marked that as this period in which, I won't get too in the weeds here, but like before World War II, between like the early modern period or like, 19th century, we might say, in World War II, exorcism and possession isn't talked about a whole lot. It's kind of seen as kind of kooky. But then around World War II, people start getting interested in it again, primarily because people are interested in like, to what extent are we free to think things, or to what extent is, the Soviet Union brainwashing us, and that kind of thing. And that kind of helps to sort of revive this interest in human unfreedom, diabolical cults, the devil, the exorcist, etc. So basically I got interested in all of this because during like the COVID pandemic, there were all of these articles being written about like, I lost my grandfather to online scrolling. He got brainwashed or whatever by scrolling through Instagram and reading all of this anti-vaccine rhetoric. And I got interested, like, to what extent, like, I'm scrolling on Instagram all the damn time. Like, to what extent am I getting brainwashed too? And so I got really interested in kind of the I guess from like since my background's in communication, like the way that we use the word brainwashing and to describe what sort of processes, psychologically, what is really going on here. And that took me down the rabbit hole of thinking about from there, like cults and demonic cults or cults of politics or whatever. And so, yeah, I mean, the thing about it is Kenneth Burke has this great quote that I include in the book. He says, like, an ideology is like a spirit that comes down and gets in your body and makes you hop around. And if a different spirit had come down to inhabit your body, you would have hopped around in a different way. And I was so, seduced by that quote because, it essentially describes the way that we think of ideology, which is like the hypodermic needle model. Here I am living my life and I have ideology injected in me from politics or from culture. And now suddenly I am that thing. I think and talk in that way. And, cultural studies theorists will tell you for a long time now, like the hypodermic needle model of understanding culture's impact on us is pretty dated, it kind of completely removes any sort of like individual preference or, differences in terms of race or gender. And so I dig into that a little bit, to what extent are people actually kind of like taken over by ideologies? To what extent is that really a process that happens? And to what extent is it, ethical and justifiable to have someone come in and try to, like, if you will, exercise the ideology out of them, and whether that's something that happens, or is that more of like a framing, a way that we describe a different, other types of processes. That's the quick and dirty of it. Listen, the book is crazy. There's a lot of vomit. There's a lot of blood. It's incredibly graphic. And again, I'm going to make a statement about it soon, especially considering it's the issues with its publication.
Interesting. Yeah, we'll talk offline about that later on, perhaps. But yeah, I'll press the issue a little bit. I mean, especially in the sort of general coordinates that I tend to find myself in philosophically, which of course is connected to my politics as well. It's hard for me to imagine something like a great transformation in politics without some sort of ecstatic transformation. But then again, when we think of something like Make America Great Again, or even any capture by nostalgia, we can make an analogy that it's almost like a kind of possession. And so if we're thinking in Craig's mythology anyway, and I wonder what Grafton's mythology looks like here, there is a kind of tension or a war between the prospect of this kind of like Dionysian explosion away from all the fetters of the past, and the kind of images that keep us clamped into these old paradigms, or stuck in the hauntological eddy, from 1978 to maybe 1971 to 2001 or something like that. Wait, no, I'm sorry. Man, I will say 1968 to 2001.
There you go.
But, yeah, those are some pretty definitive dates if you think about it. So I guess the question is, and this is something that's been part of my personal and political and philosophical problematic is, how do we do politics beyond ideology? How do we think freedom outside of something like conditioning or brainwashing, or just complete immersion in a discourse, right? Because at one level, the way that nostalgia is deployed is to, exacerbate this tendency to immerse oneself in the familiar in some sense, right? And I'm sure I could probably go on at length to articulate this question in even more detailed way. But I mean, what do you think, like when it comes to sort of the emotional tonality or affect that's demanded of us to effectuate like real political change? And of course, it requires like boots on the ground, fighting particular fights in a collective manner. But I think one of the risks is, even for us on the left, is to fall into these sort of ideological ghettos or get trapped in certain ideas that exists all over the political spectrum. And I was curious if you had thoughts about that, and if that attaches to any of your work on nostalgia as well.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it is hard to sometimes imagine like a politics that makes room for an emotion like nostalgia, which I do categorize as an emotion. And you don't have true political progress without allowing your emotions to sit at the table and help make the decisions, because they're going to. I mean, people are going to use anger in a way to fuel them, to fight against oppressive regimes or what have you. But there's a surprising panoply of emotions that can show up in these kinds of moments of demonstration, organization, fighting for a better future, resistance. And it can be weird to think about nostalgia having a place at that table, because for so long it has been kind of abused in its framing, if you will. So for me, I see nostalgia just like any other emotion. And I don't know if I would necessarily characterize it as a negatively valenced emotion, like something like anger or jealousy, where it's kind of like, I know this has a purpose, but a lot of times it gets in the way. I get too angry. I say something I don't mean. I let jealousy talk to me. And next thing you know, I'm making bad decisions. Nostalgia sometimes can seduce in that way too. And yet, the psychological research on nostalgia shows that, it tends to be pretty pro-social. People enjoy indulging in it. When they get together with their friends and talk about the good old days, they tend to feel pretty good while doing it. So we can't necessarily ignore that. But at the same time, you and I know that, when it shows up in kind of public messaging, a lot of times it's done to advance ideas that might not align with democracy. And so, or that might, lead to a better future for all people, or it might just lead to a good future for the rich and powerful, if you will. But to me, again, I come from my backgrounds in rhetoric and in communication. So I'm always thinking about like how we frame nostalgia. What sort of goals are we trying to achieve while using this emotion? Is the goal to like, essentially oppress marginalized groups? Yeah, we don't want to use any emotion to do that, obviously, And so for me, step one is being able to recognize when messaging is meant to pander to a certain emotion. Okay, this is my public speaking instructor coming out. Okay, and so like if we've got a politician who is very obviously like, trying to press a nostalgic button, I think it's important to recognize that's what they're doing. Just as it was important to recognize when, George W. Bush was using fear and anger in certain ways in his speeches to justify the quote unquote war on terror. Or when Barack Obama would use, the emotion of hope to be able to, achieve certain goals with his messaging as well. Like, this is no different. We have folks like Donald Trump, political institutions. Certainly, it's very easy for us to be like, to go back to the AI video, to be scrolling through Instagram and run into this age-old retro bait, if you will, and see it and be able to recognize it. But it can be very difficult to recognize it maybe, outside of a like a heavily mediated context like social media. But that's step one. And then I think step two is to be able to figure out how to resist when we interpret a certain emotional messaging to be maybe not so good for us or for everybody. And then to be able to create our own messaging. What does nostalgia look like if we're like folks on the left or people who are really interested in critical theory? What does that look like? Are there elements of the past that might be worth revisiting or thinking about? And also, does yearning always require action? I stand by that. Make America Great Again is incredibly dangerous because it's all about action. It's the make part, that's kind of really dangerous.
If you don't mind, I'd like to interject there.
Sure.
I absolutely agree with that, and I'm not sure. I mean, we have a fair few folks listening right now, but we just put out an episode with Federico Campagna on his new book, Other Worlds. And there's a section, I would say like a 2 to 3 page stretch, where he talks about the politics of nostalgia, actually. And he makes a distinction that I think is very convincing to me. It's made on psychological grounds, and I don't know, I would offer some qualifications to it. But the one thing that he says, particularly in regards to Make America Great Again, if we want to use that as an example, is that when a certain kind of imagining, a nostalgic imagining, as an image, as part of our imaginary, wants more purchase on the real, because it is ashamed of its status as imaginary. Now that's the sort of ontological leap that we have to make here, is imagining an image that's ashamed of its status as being an image. But I really like that, of course.
Yeah.
I love the weirdness of that as well. But the idea that in its shame about itself, attempts to impose itself on the present or drag the present back into the past in such a way as to collapse itself upon it. And so that's what we see, is a world in which we cannot acknowledge the imagined, as the imaginary, as the bliss of the imaginary. And like you say, that there are some yearnings that cannot, well, I will argue they cannot be fulfilled ultimately.
Sure.
If we're reading somebody like Klosowski, he would call this a phantasm, this sort of inchoate obsession that, throughout our lifeline will attach to different objects, but no object can ever truly allow it to achieve a kind of satisfaction. But it's in the recognition of that yearning. And as James Hillman says, it's not necessarily about capturing the object of our yearning. It's about learning to love the longing that we feel in some ways.
Right.
And that is transformative in and of itself, and might even to some extent inoculate us from some of the problems we see with Make America Great Again. And so that would require a completely different orientation towards the imagination, images, and so forth, that we're like, hey, and there's a kind of psychological maturity, we might say there, where we can recognize an image as such and treat it in a way, but give it a privilege, or give it an ontological status. Like I know what that thing is, and it doesn't make it any less important. That's the thing. It doesn't make it any less important. It's not that we're ignoring it, not paying tribute to it or whatever. There's a whole host of aesthetic activities, dispositions that we can take towards that to bring honor to those images without pulling them into the present or dragging the present back into the imaginary and sandwiching them together. But maybe you can respond to
completely.
that.
I mean, it's the same thing that they teach you in therapy. It's like, I have intrusive thoughts, I have these whatever, and your therapist says you have to recognize that that's what they are. And sometimes they have to show up and they come and go. And I mean, I feel this way about our emotions as well. And, that's why if you sign up for the course, what we're going to talk about is we're going to establish kind of a framework here of nostalgia. This is an emotion. It's something that is it tends to be kind of, it's not like always individually felt, but sometimes there you go. There's the promo, collectively felt and collectively realized. And that when we see something like the AI video and we go, oh, that's just a bunch of nostalgia. What do we mean by that when we say that? And what is exactly going on? Is it because we feel a certain way, or do we use the term to describe a certain type of advertising phoniness that we've come to know and recognize and abhor? But yeah, absolutely. I mean, to me, this is an emotion. It can drive certain types of action. Although I would say when you go back and look at the history of nostalgia, the reason why it freaked out so many military leaders in France and why it freaked out jurists and psychologists in the Western world for a long time is because it did not really inspire action. People would get nostalgic and stop working or sit around and daydream. And it was like really ticking off a lot of the capitalist overlords, if you will, you know? And so the idea that it kind of gets, that it gets used in this, MAGA, Make America Great Again kind of way is really kind of a strangulation of the emotion, do work for me, when really the emotion itself is a very anti-work feeling. I'm just thinking about the past. That's all I'm doing.
I'm going to pause for station identification, as they say in the industry. You're listening to the Acid Horizon Research Commons. But seriously, folks, this is a chance to take a course with the great Grafton Tanner, who's written Babbling Corpse and The Hours Have Lost Their Clock. And with the Acid Horizon Research Commons, this is one of the things that we can provide is these rare opportunities to spend 4 weeks at a very affordable price to get immersed in a particular topic, develop a piece of writing if you want, just engage in an ongoing conversation and have a deep experience in something that is intellectual, but not connected to the fetters of academia. I'm going to actually twist to Will right now. And
also support Grafton Tanner.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
There is
the man
that
needs
element.
money.
I don't want to but us, too.
Will, I have
well.
a question for you.
Sure.
We haven't talked about this personally, and maybe this is getting off the track a little bit, but we'll connect it back.
Embarrass me in front of the
No. Well, you'll only embarrass yourself if you choose to. But if let's talk about Gavin Newsom. Yes, okay. The reason I bring him up is it seems his gambit has been to appropriate the emotional tone and the rhetoric of Trump, but just paint it blue. So it's like we're getting another version of MAGA through this. Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so okay, I know what you mean when you're trying to bring Gavin Newsom into this. As someone who spent some of my youth among what idiots call like the lanyard class, Gavin Newsom sort of straddles an interesting sort of line in that he's trying to evoke a kind of a 90s politician that never existed. He represents both the promise of the third way liberalism that we saw coming out of groups like Third Way, Brookings, and so on. Brookings, of course, being the Brookings that was raided or attempted to be raided by the Nixon administration, while at the same time also possessing the, for lack of a better word, Greek statuesque strongman aesthetics that, particular 30-something-year-old white men have clung to. There's the joke is welcome back. Who's the main character of the book American Psycho? Patrick Bateman. Welcome back, Patrick Bateman. Right. But this idea that politics can be slick again, that politics has lost its slickness, that in fact I want to be misdirected. I want there to be a sort of playful misgiving of truth, and that in fact the deployment of the truth of politics is through misdirection, and what we have lost is that playful misdirection. And in fact, Gavin Newsom's overproduction of both himself and his policy disposition being completely unclear now, right? Both between aesthetics and policy, right? And of course, policy is an aesthetics. Like we can't. Like I don't want to give that to liberalism, that in fact, like, there is a programmatic politics. So, I put on my liberalism hat and my electoralism hat, which is increasingly hard to do as I get older. And Gavin Newsom reminds me of a kind of burgeoning petite bourgeoisie in public life that existed in the early 2000s and doesn't anymore. Gavin Newsom is the kind of world that made possible the blogosphere of Matty Iglesias, Ezra Klein, etc. All of those awful, spaces. And I think that there is a nostalgic, not nostalgic in the sense of an emotion, but of it's a different kind of thing. It's not reactive in the easiest sense of the term. And of course, reactionary, like, things don't have to be reactionary to be bad, to be right wing, to be, but in fact, Gavin Newsom is this sort of strange straddling of it puts the make America great again, the clear driving force, right? Gavin Newsom represents the pragmatic idealism of right-wing American culture, where it's like, oh, okay, we've conceded, right? We've conceded to the strictures of this bureaucracy. We've conceded to the strictures of contemporary economy. And in fact, what we have now is like the greatest person to ever come out of like a Goldman Sachs internship program in the summer of 2002 ever. Like, he is wearing his white collar shirt from J. Crew like no one else. Like, he has styled that Land's End pair of pants better than you ever could. And I think this shirt is Land's End, actually. Can I get it to be visible? Yeah, it's Land's End. Like, I'm guilty of this as well, right? Like, I'm gonna go walk in and teach a class about political philosophy, and I'm going to produce myself, right? In a certain sense. And I think people find that dishonesty more honest than the false honesty of American reaction, of contemporary American reactionary politics of the Republican Party. Like, I think they actually find that dishonesty to be refreshing. And in a certain sense, it's why characters like J.G. Ballard and Jean Baudrillard don't ring as true anymore. Like, because that criticism just isn't, it's not as prophetic as it was. And like, the whole question of a hyperreal simulacrum is not compelling in the way that it maybe would have been 20 years ago. And now, we need to show.
Let me stop you there, because, all right, let's say
Okay.
that's true. Maybe the hyper real, have we gone beyond it, or has it been rendered irrelevant? Are we in a more mature stage of it? I knew you'd love that.
I think the question of like hyper reality still ultimately hinges on a reactionary disposition towards the possibility of a reality, or a sort of like the question of like layers. I still think is like the question of a stucco Christ still makes real the salvation in Christ, and that's the thing you need to escape. It's not necessarily these distinctions that are ultimately about communication, but I think are far more tethered to just the basic sort of metaphysics of this epoch about life, about work, and none of that all of that has stayed relatively stable since the dawn of the 20th century. Like, we're in a really, really, really long period that started, I think, around World War I and has remained somewhat stagnant. Like, there are moments, but like our basic expectation of what governance means, of what subjectivity looks like, of what the worker is, there have been shifts between ordoliberalism, neoliberalism, but all of it has always come back to the fact that the human being exists to make, right? And it's that make in Make America Great Again that is particularly bizarre, right? A politics of actualization of the past. I'm nostalgic for the days President Bartlett was in charge, right? I love this because that's the kind of thing that Gavin Newsom represents. Like there was no West Wing adoration on Capitol Hill. That's a lie. That like there was this generation of kids that were like, I want to be Jed Bartlett when I grow up. It's like, no, they hate that stuff. They hate that stuff. I like, so what Americans are yearning for is to be returned to a kind of they want their noble lie to be more obvious. And I think that like there's a kind of fundamental disrespect in the kind of lying that you get from a sort of Trumpian parliamentary politics, and a kind of respectful lie that you get from a Gavin Newsom style of misdirection. I actually don't think Gavin Newsom's politics are important. I don't think his disagreements with Donald Trump are important. I still think that the same people who are saying that he's the future of opposition to Donald Trump would be saying it irrespective of what his individual policies are. Because
but doesn't that risk a kind of glibness? Like that's exactly how Donald Trump got elected.
Yeah.
Right? Like
Yeah.
the kind of objection you're raising is very similar to the ones that were being raised against the possibility of Donald Trump even being considered.
No, but that's precisely why Gavin Newsom is so strong.
Exactly.
Yeah,
I mean, I think that's
like,
what I wanted to pick.
And
anyway.
whether this has anything to do with nostalgia, I think it comes back to the fact of like from where does Gavin Newsom's like cultural signifiers hail? And I can't answer that question. I mean, of course, I'm not a political analyst. I would never want to do that to myself, and I don't care enough to. I think Gavin Newsom is a remarkable face for a neoliberalism that no longer exists. But like that's precisely why he's so popular. Is like he's what Slick Willie wasn't.
Well, let's get back to Grafton. Grafton, I don't know if you want to put your cards on the table in this leg of the discussion here, but you're welcome to, or we can move on.
It's outside of my wheelhouse a little bit, but
I'm on the record about Gavin Newsom of all things, as if that.
Well, Grafton, I will say this then. Another question that I had, and I think we brushed past it, but when we look back at Babbling Corpse or The Hours Have Lost Their Clock, is there anything that you see that, I mean, still resonates with you, or, given the years that have transpired since the publication of those books, is there something that you would revise in your own thinking about nostalgia since having written them? Yeah,
completely. And in fact, my last book was called Foreverism, and
that's right, yeah,
by Polity, and that is really like a I kind of took the argument from The Hours Have Lost Their Clock and kind of turned it upside down and like shook the box and was like, what might it was an experiment really, is because in The Hours Have Lost Their Clock I made this argument that like, nostalgia is very much a defining emotion of our time, and like, and went from there, and to look at the different ways that nostalgia is used, and to argue that like people are going to feel nostalgic in a modern era in which, where we have, certain rights taken from us and we're being forced to work all the time and all that stuff. Okay. So then in Foreverism, I essentially made this opposite argument. And I said, actually, when you really look at the history of nostalgia, what you see is a history of people trying to eliminate nostalgic feelings. And this is maybe a bit of a preview of some of the stuff we'll talk about in the second half of the course. But in that book, I made the argument that actually that it really, like, in the present day, that's really still what's going on. So instead of like the old, what Foucault might call like disciplinary societies of like, back in the day when people would try to like, educate or civilize the nostalgia out of you. Now what institutions do is they'll say, well, we'll just give you what you should be nostalgic for. You ought to be nostalgic for the 1980s. So let's just give you more 1980s so that you're not nostalgic for it anymore. And it's very much the same thing, like in a process of trying to eliminate the emotion. And so it's just an experiment. I've talked about foreverism in different podcasts and different interviews. And I always say, like, this is like a thought experiment book. It could be dead wrong, but it was a way for me to, kind of blow up my own argument and just see what, if it still had any, like, any kind of traction.
Here's an interesting comment. I have been waging a holy war against nostalgia. It's an utter failure of imagination. I mean, good luck. I think this is one of the things that we've run up against here. It's nostalgia is almost on the level of intrusive thoughts in a way where, and that's one of the things that we have to honor about, I would just say psyche, our psychology. And I think of psyche in a more collective, like a group fantasy kind of way. Like, it's there. It has a presence, it has a life to it, and there is something that needs to happen, or it compels us to do something, to act or react in a certain way. I guess with that said, I mean, what's your positive spin on nostalgia, or what's the sort of approach that individuals or collectives or societies should take towards nostalgia that would be more, maybe not more productive, but would be that would avoid having them succumb to the pitfalls that we see folks succumbing to today? Yeah.
I mean, the thing about emotions is that sometimes they feel like they get in the driver's seat, whether we like them there or not. And they cause us to think and act in ways that maybe challenge the identity that we built for ourselves. And nostalgia, when so much of us, are reared within a culture that prioritizes progress, moving forward, don't look back, as the Boston song says. And so, nostalgia comes along and says, you should look back. You ought to look back. And don't you miss that time? And the crazy thing is like, and maybe the more logical light of day, you don't miss that time, but there could be weird, like, I had this moment the other day when, like, I felt this nostalgia for, like, this period of my life when I was very young, probably too young. And I started watching like anime for the first time. It would come on Cartoon Network in the afternoons in a series called Toonami, which still exists in some capacity today. And I had this weird nostalgia for that time. And like, you could not pay me enough money to go back to that time. No way. You know what I mean? I don't want to be a kid again. Ooh. But, like, and homework and like, there's a reason why, you escape through something like anime and you're like in school all day and working and doing all this stuff. But yet I felt this nostalgia for that time. And I think that it could be extremely confusing for your average person to experience a yearning for a time in which maybe they know wasn't so great. And yet there's something there on an emotional level, that kind of like that presses a button in us. And again, it may not mean anything and it may just need to pass on its own. It may need to be recognized and go, there it is once again, and so that's kind of the way that I think about it, is like, if we want to have like I think it's all about having kind of like a good productive relationship with our emotions, whether it's nostalgia or anger, or even like the positive ones like hope, or even like, oh my gosh, God forbid, something like happiness or joy, that we might describe it as one of the primary emotions. I think it's important to have sort of a positive relationship with them, and to try not to, like, this is going to sound so like therapy speak, but to try not to have like give ourselves a hard time for feeling these emotions as they come through, because the thing is that once we start to feel them and we try to suppress them, it's kind of too late. You're already feeling them. And so for me, I'm a big fan of what some emotion scholars call like reappraisal of emotions. I think you could do this, yourself, but also do it when thinking about like nostalgia and political messaging. So I think it's important to ask, like, if I were to act on this emotion, number one, what are the short and long-term consequences of acting on that emotion? Okay. Like, is this going to benefit me or anybody in the long run? All right. Two,
Mhm.
where did this emotion come from? Is there
Mm.
what triggered it? What might have caused that? Because when I'm thinking about just the emotion, I might not be thinking about the trigger. When I change my focus to think about the trigger, then maybe I could figure out where that's coming from. Sometimes nostalgia just comes through, and sometimes it is maybe like a warning that something might not be right. Maybe not everything, but maybe one or two things. And to me, I think those are really important, as well as the third part, which is like, maybe not being so hard on yourself or feeling them, trying to find a silver lining. This is like really important for people who experience anger and then like shame themselves later on, and to be like, oh,
Mm.
why did I feel that way? And then in the studies on anger, it's important it shows that it's important for people to tell themselves like, okay, yes, I felt that anger, but I'm not an angry person. Same thing. It's like, okay, yes, I felt that nostalgia, but I am not some like nostalgic, weepy person or something,
Mm.
I just think that these are important because I think once we have kind of the tools to be able to reappraise certain emotions, it then becomes a little bit easier to know what to do with them when we encounter them scrolling through social media or hearing them, like out of the mouth of a politician.
Mm. Just another quick check with the audience, listeners, and anybody who's just checking in now. This is Grafton Tanner with us. We're doing the politics of nostalgia. Grafton is doing a course with the Asset Horizon Research Commons. It's going to be the very first course that we offer alongside another course on Francois Laruelle, hosted by Jeremy R. Smith. You can spend most of September and a little bit of October with Grafton as he guides you through various theoretical materials, some of his own work, and a series of 60 to 90-minute discussions over a period of 4 weeks at a very reasonable price. And if you do this, it's going to allow the Asset Horizon Research Commons to take root. One of the things that we're trying to do is we are aiming at gaining a license for essentially a kind of accreditation that would allow us not only to host more teachers on our platform, but then offer a kind of equivalency. Like instead of going to like the Cal State system, for example, in the United States, and spending thousands upon thousands of dollars for a master's degree to perhaps, get a writing sample worthy of getting you into a PhD program, you can tick away at courses, 1 or 2 per semester with the Asset Horizon Research Commons. And then that over time would allow you to, build up a writing sample, something like that, or just enjoy your time, steep yourself in rigorous intellectual work with notable scholars, writers, authors, philosophers, and what have you. With that said, we have some other folks. Will, I'm going to have you react to this one that came up here just a little
Oh,
bit ago,
Lord.
and yeah, and
Well, I
then
mean,
then we'll have Grafton have a go at it too.
Yeah, I mean, I'm obviously going to have the Benjaminian response to it. I also think that like it's a relic of manifest destiny. I think that progressivism in the American context is largely was largely a a part of a political sort of framework that there's a kind of relationship between the state and union workers, right, that could produce the ideal economic orientation. It was a turn of the century movement in the American imaginary that we return to, right? There are a handful of figures who we associate with progressivism, but then there are also like these sort of either presidential candidates or contemporary senators and so on that we call sort of progressive. But progressivism in the American imagination is really a question of the production of the right economy, right, of the good economy, of the right work, of the good work, and even the most critical of critical theorists often collapsed into this sort of economistic thinking. Even Theodore Adorno at the end of his life, and Horkheimer in very different ways, radically different ways. But when you say it's a relic of manifest destiny, I really like that, in as much as like rather than the United States sort of dominating and destroying entire peoples, now it's a it's Cesare's or Foucault's boomerang, right? And now the final domination is of subjectivity, right? And the complete sort of arrival or manifestation of a quote unquote work life that is perfectly managed, perfectly executed, and retains social and political reproduction at the optimal level, right? And that was the dream, right? And that's what Keynes and others pick up, and then the ordo liberals take seriously, is like the reproduction of the worker is in fact the center of commerce. And obviously that's where like Gary Becker and notions of human capital and so on come from. So like it all comes from progressivism. So whenever I see people say like, oh, I'm a leftist, I'm a progressive, I'm like, oh, okay. So that makes very little sense. I think that my response to progressivism is sort of like, no, I actually think you need to retain a certain level of negation. and be somewhat, I would rather trade in and be accused of nihilism than progressivism.
Grafton, I'm going to give this question back to you, but with a little bit of a twist. I mean, do you think there are ways in which the notion of progress or progressivism in general has been co-opted by nostalgic narratives?
Yeah, yes. And to me, I think, and I've written about this a little bit. This is sort of like the beginning of foreverism. I was trying to make this very long-winded argument, but basically, what I was trying to say is like, the progress narratives, the progress discourses that used to really, oil the machinery, if you will, and that some folks really believed in. And again, it was a major reason why some people were super threatened by nostalgia, is because it seemed to be so anti-progressive. It was the opposite of moving into the future and the upward arc trajectory and all that. That over the last, I don't know, couple of decades, maybe, that there seems to be sort of and maybe not even that long, seems to be a bit of a feeling that like one can't fully believe in the progress discourses anymore. They don't ring as true as maybe they used to. And so again, this is like to bring it back to like Donald Trump, but we could see it in folks like the, Joe Biden messaging and, certain other, Clinton, if you will, Democratic messaging. But Trump is kind of like the best at this, is to essentially say, there is no forward movement anymore. And if you really believe that there is, yeah, you really are kind of like a relic of the past, to refer back to Laura's question. You kind of are yourself nostalgic. And so to believe in progress is to kind of be like, delusional today. That's kind of like some of the Trump messaging, and that the only way forward is to go back. And so to me, I do think that there's been kind of I don't know, like I use this example in the book where I talk about, I think it was when Pete Buttigieg was running for president, and he was very much like talking about progress and hope and doing kind of like the Obama messaging again. And like, it didn't work, and I think it's because you have a number of people who really don't buy into it anymore. And can you blame them? I mean, the idea that like, especially the United States, that it's getting better in any way and that things are getting easier, that is not true. And so so anyway, there is a certain element of nostalgia here. People are certainly nostalgic for progress. I think the kind of centrist Democrats are absolutely nostalgic for the days of progress, and a new kind of weapon has shown up, and it's this sort of return weapon that has been popularized by folks like Trump.
One of the decades that has gotten off the hook in this conversation so far has been the 1990s, strangely. Situated so comfortably between the golden age that is the 80s, and then, of course, well, the early aughts. And we have to talk about 9/11 nostalgia at some point before we wrap this up. But
of course.
Yeah, I guess one of the things, I mean, I was a high school student in the 1990s, well, the early part of the 1990s, and then college in the latter part. But I just kind of wanted to go back to something previously. You know, we talked about nostalgia almost having this Stockholm syndrome effect on us, to the extent that, like, look, I don't, these years of my life, whatever they were, you know, I'll pick 2004 to 2010, were just absolutely terrible. But, you know, people, I mean, that's not necessarily, do you want me to give you the real years? My bad years were probably 2004 to or the early part of 2007. There's some good music around that time though too.
There was.
Thankfully,
There was.
thankfully there
Yeah.
was. That's what got me through. But it's interesting because one attaches themselves to a time or to a decade in which they experienced a lot of pain and suffering. I mean, I was a kid in the 1980s. If we want to talk about the 1980s, like even elementary school, the later part of elementary school into middle school, I was just racked with anxiety, just the terror of like homework, deadlines, expectations, obligations, and everything else besides. I have to say, it was a joy becoming an adult.
Yeah.
And like many of us, I mean, there are things in my childhood to which I look back fondly, but at the same time, I wonder if, you know, I can't be alone in this experience. You know, I mean, how many of us out there were just absolutely on edge at school for whatever reason, whether it was, you know, just a certain friend group, bullies, homework, expectations, sheer boredom. The emotions were so intense in that regard. And there may have been oases of aesthetic expression, release from the grip of those feelings. And maybe it's that sort of like push and pull movement that like sets the seed for later nostalgia. I don't know. That's speculative, but maybe you can respond to that. I don't know. And you probably grew up a little bit in the 90s.
Yeah. I was born in 90. So,
there you go.
yeah, tell them my birthday's in 2 days. So,
hey, if you want to wish Grafton Tanner a happy birthday, the best way to do it is enroll
we
in
have
the
the
politics
same
of
birthday.
nostalgia. Wait, your
We have the
birthday's
same
in 2
birthday.
days?
Yeah, the 26th.
No way.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah, we have the same birthday. Happy
Bro.
birthday.
All right.
Happy birthday, man.
Okay, so here's what you have to do. You have to become a patron on Acid Horizon so that we can buy Will a birthday gift this month. So go ahead to the Acid Horizon Patreon, subscribe at the $5 level. You're going to get conversations like these that we have behind our paywall and so forth. And then Grafton Tanner, September 10th, begins his course. So enroll in that course and give Grafton the best birthday gift of his adult life, as he is now going to talk a little bit about his childhood.
Yeah, I did grow up a little bit in the 90s. You know, I taught students at in college for a couple years, and many of them were born in like the 2000s. And so they didn't experience the 90s, but many of them were, you know, at least they kind of like signaled maybe a nostalgia for the 90s in the way that they dressed. And, you know, kind of like if we're going to talk about fashion, like the backlash against sort of like millennial tight-fitting clothing, skinny jeans, things like that. And so a lot of my students were wearing some of the stuff that I wore in the 90s, you know, it's like baggier pants, baggier tops, like, you know, what I've got going on right now, you know. And so, you know, who wants to be in tight clothes, you know? And so, but many of them didn't experience the 90s. I get this question a lot. In fact, I have it almost, you know, every time I talk about nostalgia, is people are like, how can it be possible for a person to be nostalgic for a time period they didn't grow up in? You know, it's because it's like, you know, I've definitely had moments of feeling nostalgia for like the music of the 1980s, some of the cool bands, you know, and yet I didn't experience that. And the fact is that like, you just don't have to have experienced a certain time period in order to feel the emotion of like, you know, of like being drawn to it and desiring it in some way. Especially, it's incredibly easy, especially when you have so much of like the past, like if you want to talk about the 80s or even the 90s, being reframed in a way that where it seems like there's freedom and youth. And what it's really trying to say is like, I want to be able to live free and do what I want to do and hang out late with friends and experience first love. And even though I didn't go through it in that time period, I maybe am nostalgic for that, and then it sort of gets kind of transferred from like maybe when you grew up in the 2000s to the 90s or even earlier. But look, a lot of great bands in the 90s, you had folks like Jeff Buckley, who I think was the greatest,
Amazing. Yeah.
And you had, Radiohead, which everybody knows what I think about them. And, the birth of Daft Punk,
Yeah.
so yeah, of
No,
course.
absolutely. Absolutely. Gosh, I saw so many great bands live, and for the first time, I actually saw Limp Bizkit before they were big. They opened up for Faith No More.
Oh man.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Faith No More is like, that's my jam right there.
Yes.
But so yeah, there's an old head in here, guys.
Hey,
Yeah, but Will, we've talked about this before. Let's talk about 9/11 nostalgia. Now, when 9/11 happened,
We've talked
I
about
was-
this a lot.
yeah. This is like what we are now in the Acid Horizon group chat, basically, but live. So the when 9/11 happened, I was actually in Japan. It might have been my second or third year there, but I want to say to a certain extent that I was assimilated, somewhat acculturated, and definitely in the groove of Japanese lifestyle, which meant to a certain extent I was kind of checked out of the U.S. a little bit. I wasn't even sure if I was coming home, but it was a very weird day for me personally when I remember it was nighttime there when the plane struck, and my girlfriend at the time is like, "Oh, look at that!" And I remember seeing smoke coming out of one of the towers, and I'm like, "Huh, wonder what happened there." I thought accident right away, and then I'm like, "Wait, I remember they tried to bomb it." And while I was watching it, I saw the second plane hit, and I was like, I was wondering, am I watching a replay? How can I be watching a replay when the building's still on fire? Like that's the sort of lapse that I was trying to negotiate. But then, the reality became as real as it could have been. And I remember going into work the next day, and it just a pall fell over the teacher's room in the at the school where I worked, and like everybody came up to me, and I was the spokesperson for the United States that day, for better or for worse. But it was a very, very strange day in my life. And then, considering the activism that followed, and I would say that it was the events of 9/11 which ultimately kicked off to a certain extent my own becoming political, deeply political, radical. And at a certain point, like I would say in the year 2005 or 2006, it would have been inconceivable to play in the kind of dark humor that we see online today about 9/11, that young people who were born maybe even after the event kind of play around with online.
Definitely after. I mean, we're much older than we think we are.
Yeah,
like,
I know. And
your
the years are getting away
average
from it.
meme account has like an admin who's making $150,000 a year reposting other people's content, and they're 18.
I'm changing careers.
Yeah, seriously. Well, Will, I mean, maybe Will, what's your whole take on the that phenomenon?
What's your take on 9/11?
No, not on 9/11 itself, but that reaction to it.
The reaction to it. I mean, I grew up in the reaction to 9/11. So I grew up in New York, and a lot. So so for you, it was a politicizing moment. I have a friend who is an Adorno scholar at my program. He's about 10 years older than me, maybe a little less. And all of his friends joining the Marines, he was like, "No, wait, this is a politicizing moment." Like this was when he realized that, like, actually, this is the moment where a decision has to be made. 9/11 is to the kids what JFK is to us. Yeah, probably. But I think growing up in the sort of response to 9/11, what I see is the 1979 9/11 of Allende. I should put these on the screen so people know what I'm responding to. But the securitarian discourse that sort of became commonplace, but also on top of that, the amorphous figure of the terrorist became concrete in its amorphous nature, and nostalgia ended up playing a huge role in the understanding of 9/11. That 9/11 was the moment when American politics lost its honesty, or there are people who are nostalgic for the moments after 9/11 because supposedly there was this wonderful moment of community. Of course, that wonderful moment of community was lined with a remarkable racial hatred that was still definitive for the average New York experience growing up in the 2000s. There are all sorts of responses to 9/11, but the one that always sort of sticks with me the most, at least at the level of nostalgia, is the discourse about shoes and about security kiosks, or how to get onto an airplane. Something was taken from you, and what was taken from you was the ease of your transport, which I think is a really interesting way to frame the event, in as much as what it allowed for was the event is obscured by not its response, like, because the war in Iraq fades from memory so quickly, and even like the redeployment to Afghanistan fades from memory so quickly, but these tiny elements of the aftermath become part and parcel to it. So I think that at least for me, what 9/11 meant growing up was a change in what the word security meant. And I can't help but feel like it's similar to students who have to grow up in a post Columbine world as well, where securitarian measures are now so obviously a part of the daily subjectivating process of going to high school. But at least for 9/11, there was this assertion, not so much maybe an actual collective trauma, but this assertion of trauma, which I think was bigger, in fact, than the actual experience. GTA 3 deleting the towers before the game's release, yeah, that's actually, I think, a good point too, as strange as it is. Like, there was a sort of assertion of sensitivity that was bigger than the actual sensitivity itself. I think the response to Susan Sontag was part of that. The response to Noam Chomsky with chickens coming home to roost was a part of that, which is, of course, part of a cultural discourse. But I think that what also defined and what was cemented in 9/11 was like the strength of the 24-hour news cycle as well, and the ability for an event to actually sustain itself within the 24-hour news cycle and become a sort of developing and developing but also founding element of our discourse, because the 24-hour news cycle was birthed out of it too. And I think that for me, what the response meant was, like, I grew up in a conservative politics. Like, there's just no if, and, or buts about it. Like, the framework of global terror was of a holy war, and that just had to be accepted, and that's terrifying to think about, especially in like a multicultural place like New York City. I think that the way in which, but it also, okay, this will be my last point. What 9/11 shows in sort of contemporary discourse is that there are moments of rupture that are not so much because of their events they cause a rupture, but in fact how they're invoked, how they're deployed, marks the rupture. And I think that's where I would disagree with both, because there are two French philosophers, Jacques Derrida and Jean Baudrillard, had a debate about what 9/11 meant, and they were on the opposite sides of the same coin as it pertains to a philosophy of the event and continuity in American foreign policy. Of course, Jacques Derrida was in the middle of writing Rogues, right, which is about the notion of a rogue state and so on. And Derrida argues that that 9/11 culminated as this sort of embarrassment for the United States. Of course, I think that like the United States was already embarrassed. Like this idea that there needed to be a sort of moment or rupture. Again, you go back to Vietnam. Like there was no need for a kind of moment of rupture where American policy fails and kills a whole bunch of people and so on and so forth. Quote unquote fails. So for me, it just meant like security took on a new meaning, at least is the way that the mythology was told to me. Right, the mythology is that like what it meant to be a safe American changed when I was a kid, and I also never quite understood what like war meant, because there was never like a state versus state war, but there was this persistent and extraordinarily violent war whose mythological founding is this event. But at the same time, it was never treated as one with a definitive enemy. So like it was all in the name of security, and that notion of security had fundamentally changed.
Grafton, how about you on 9/11?
Yeah, I don't think that you have somebody said this in the chat, about like the birth of like a constant mediated presence, and the birth of the feed. Yeah, I think that's a great way to think about it, but yeah, I don't think you have that without an event like 9/11 that kind of introduces this or reaffirms this idea that people need to stay in touch with each other all the time. People need to stay up to date with what's going on. And it really kind of like, I guess set the stage for something like the iPhone to show up and to be like this. Well, here is the technology. Like, sure, you had cell phones, but this is now the technology that we can use to really keep in touch with one another all the time, make sure we're safe and all of this. I mean, this is like some of the psychologist Sherry Turkle, some of her earliest writings, was very much on this. And I just think that, that 24-hour news ramps up in its immediacy and its power, and certainly the kind of like the device, don't leave home without your device kind of mentality. And, I think these are kind of intertwined. And I think when people, long for a time before, the obsession with security or whatever, or the targeting of Americans that might be like interlopers, like terrorists or whatever, pre 9/11 yearning it very much dovetails with the pre-digital yearning as well. It's kind of fascinating to me that some of the same people who buy into like the AI slop about the 1980s are some of the same ones who love the security state, because it kind of reaffirms this American ethos as being all powerful. And what they're yearning for is essentially a time before that, and a time before, communication technologies that are supposedly keeping us safe.
I think that's a fascinating paradox to point out, that it's like the same individuals who speak about like epochal generational changes, like, oh, like I was able to play outside and so on and so forth, are the same ones who consistently monitor the security of the state, of their families, so on and so forth. And, and maybe this is like the quiet reactionary politics of Gen X, is that like, on the one hand, and I said this to Craig, everyone thinks that they were the last gasp of authentic sociality rather than controlled sociality or parasociality. Like, and one way to do it is like, oh, actually the 80s, like the mark of the 80s was the 50s diner. The 50s was still, a retrospective or attempting to come to terms with the late 30s, early 40s United States that had managed to survive X, Y, and Z. They were the true generation. And it goes on and on. But the promise of the past is that what comes with it is that no, that was when space was free. Now, in fact, you have to be secure. In fact, the past was safe. The past will always be safe. But now what you need is security.
Yeah.
and like I
And it's
think
like
that
not even a choice. They'll be like,
yeah,
I mean, we have to do this.
right, yeah,
Like I have to constantly keep tabs on my family, keep tabs on my
yeah.
street, and I'm on the Nextdoor app. Did you see that person walking down the
Oh
street of my
yeah, the
neighborhood?
Nextdoor app is
Yeah.
a great
Yeah.
example of this, right?
Yeah.
Of casual like voyeuristic uh sort of it's like panopticism in its most vulgar, to the point where like it's no longer interesting. Like it's it's not even panoptic in a certain sense, because it's just so blatant. But what it ultimately becomes is like what you see on the Nextdoor app, because I have a family member, someone who is embarrassing enough to have this. And I looked at the app.
I was kicked off the app, by the way. We'll talk.
Oh,
about that later.
I'm sure you were kicked off the app. I couldn't afford a Ring doorbell if I wanted one. But I don't. Just steal my packages. I don't care. But the thing that I think is so funny is, if when you look at the Ring doorbell app, I was scrolling through it one day on, I think, my cousin's phone or somebody. It's always about individuals who should not be in that community. That's the argument. It's like, who is this person? Where are they coming from? This car doesn't look right. Very rarely is it about like, here is this teenager stealing my iPhone off the porch of my whatever, or something funny or whatever. It's often just blatant, like strange racialized speculation about individuals, walking through, cars backfiring. It's about producing, through like a constant monitoring, an exteriority that has to be out there, because it just has to be out there. And it's like the security apparatus has to promise insecurity in order to be worth it. So it has to constantly like evoke and invent enemies. And that's why it's always about like distant noises. Did people hear that? Or things like that. So it's the terror index. Yeah, I'm gonna put that up on it's the terror index.
Yeah.
But what's the JG Ballard, like the suburbs dream of terror? It's that the suburbs dream of terror. They want to be both the exteriority from racialized urban life, but also at the same time be at risk of another exteriority, which is racialized urban life. So it's just this kind of strange paradox.
Well, Grafton, we've had you for almost 2 hours. We're coming up on the 8:45 Eastern Standard Time here. And I want to make sure that we put like a nice little bow on this conversation as best as we can anyway. And I'm thinking right now, given the current state of affairs, given the ensemble of technologies and I guess you would say other cultural effects that we have in our current society, and thinking about, for example, the young people who are growing up, and maybe it's not even who's to say that somebody who's, let's say, in their mid 30s wouldn't experience something now and feel nostalgic about it 15 years later.
Yeah.
What do you think in our current time will be a sort of carryover? What do you think folks might misremember or transmogrify through the magic of nostalgia in the coming years when it comes to looking back on this decade?
I mean, I think it's anything that supports a future Americanized narrative, especially one that a lot of times is born in the United States and then exported elsewhere, of course. But like anything that supports somebody say cash, anything that supports a certain political position, probably not a great one. And again, most of these nostalgic misrememberings, they come from the top down. They're kind of decided not to sound like that. You know what I mean? But like a lot of like the I guess the like the hegemonic, if you will, nostalgias are the ones that are oftentimes pushed by major cultural institutions. Nowadays, you might think of companies like Paramount or Disney or Google or Amazon or whatever, and then certainly certain mouthpieces today, that would be someone like Donald Trump or, someone like Elon Musk even. So folks like that in the future will certainly co-opt whatever emotion they want to, including nostalgia, to achieve whatever their goal is. But for the rest of us, it could be a number of different things. I mean, sometimes it's surprising. Sometimes it's the events that make a person nostalgic go on to make them nostalgic later on, which is very paradoxical. And I actually don't have any proof of this. It's just something I came up with. But here's one example, I guess, is that when the COVID pandemic started, and I remember, I think it was Leslie Jameson who wrote that big piece about like what I learned about nostalgia during COVID or whatever. Certainly a lot of nostalgia during that time. And I remember taking a walk with my wife, and I was like, hey, listen, this is going to sound crazy, but there are going to be people who are going to be nostalgic for this time period. And she was like, really? And I said, yeah, just wait. And then about 9 months later, there were these TikTok videos that were like, hop in the time machine. We're going back to March 2020, and so it's always a surprising thing, because it's like at the same, listen, I heard this from a lot of my students too, who were the ones who were like, living with their parents, or they were like, I see memes of this online too. It's like every night with my friends playing video games during COVID. It's like, yeah, it was at the same time that all these people were dying and there was all this fear. And yet it's so funny how nostalgia orients itself to like the good times, can turn even the worst days into the good old days. And so, yeah, who knows?
We're going back to the 2 weeks when you downloaded Minecraft during the pandemic.
Yeah. Or like the Minecraft movie was such a major cultural event a couple months ago. And it's like, people are definitely going to be nostalgic for that,
I downloaded the racial justice bundle from itch.io when the George Floyd stuff went off. And I'm still playing those games 5 years later.
I'm always shocked by the get in the van. We're going back to 2015.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, 2016 is the year, man. That's what everybody's nostalgic for.
Well, not that this is, maybe I'm nostalgic about it a little bit. I mean, Acid Horizon, came almost as a direct result of the pandemic. But the rupture of the pandemic for me, I mean, everybody experienced it differently. Like some people went, continued to go to work. Whereas if you were like me, who was a working professional at the time, I was allowed to sit at home and collect a paycheck for 6 to 9 months or whatever it was before I had to get my ass out of the chair again and do something to earn that money. But which I was actually very happy to do, don't get me wrong. But I did have something interesting happen at that time that it's worthy of note in the context of this conversation. I think the date was March 9th. It was like that first week or thereabouts. You remember at the end of January and then throughout February, we were all hearing about the mysterious virus, right? And then I was teaching in the LA County jail system at the time. And this is just a good story to tell because there's something instructive here too. And the guys that I was teaching, I might have been teaching like a high school level English class or a college level English class at the time. And I would show them little bits of the news every morning. And one of the things my students actually really liked was, CNN 10. CNN has like a 10-minute news thing for students. And these guys who are adults, they loved it. And, even though I don't like CNN, it compacted like important news events into like 10-minute snippets. And this is the only exposure that some of these guys would get to the outside world. So I used it quite a bit. And they were seeing things about the disease. And there is, from a security standpoint, a risk in terms of, inmates, students in custody, I will say, finding out about something that could be like a global pandemic because it could create an uprising in the jail or the prison. Like, hey, what's going on out there? Like, they're not telling us anything about it. And I remember one of the administrators from our school came in while I was showing a little thing on the pandemic. And I'm like, hey, I'm telling you, something big is coming and not a lot of people are talking about it yet. And one of the administrators came in and said to my whole class is like, oh, coronavirus, this sort of thing has been around for a while. Not much to worry about. People are making a big deal about it. This is bound to pass, sort of thing. And then literally just a few days later, I had my laptop, I had all my books, I had my whole ensemble of teaching supplies ready to go. and I'm just getting bad vibes. Like like things are coming to a head with COVID. And I said, you know what? I'm going to go home early today. I'm just going to take, because that night I had a gig, because I was also a professional musician at the time. I'm like, I'm just going to go home and prepare for the gig. And actually, maybe I'll cancel the gig or whatever. But when I decided to go home, I didn't realize that was going to be my last day of work ever. So my work laptop, all my books, my bag, and everything was just left in the jail, and all of my fellow employees that I never saw again after that day. It's like a whole new life started for me after that. All the students I was telling coronavirus about, didn't see them again. So it truly was like a very sharp break for me in that aspect. And, you know, the things to come, you know, like I said, it afforded me this moment in which to start the podcast, and all of that was wonderful. But at the same time, you know, it was pretty traumatic in a way too. Everyone was confused. We weren't sure what was going on. I remember living in San Gabriel Valley, and it was a Wednesday, and everybody was off from work, and there was this one hiking path, and everybody in the town was just out for a hike on a Wednesday, looking at each other like, what the hell are we all doing out here? So it was a very surreal time. Anyway, I don't know. To me, there is something quite, I mean, there's a sort of weird and eeriness there that maybe adds, you know, a certain nostalgic valence to it later on that perhaps I feel from time to time. But anyway, as we wrap up, Grafton, I just want to thank you not only for being here today, but like I said, being one of the first people to be part of the Acid Horizon Research Commons. Imagining that some people are just checking in now, or they haven't listened to the entirety of this live stream, could you just talk about what folks might expect when they sign up for your course, when they enroll in the Acid Horizon Research Commons for the Politics of Nostalgia?
My hope is that people will leave this course with a very broad but nuanced understanding of nostalgia. They'll know about its history. They'll know about how it's used in a variety of different ways to, you know, further certain types of regimes, good ones, bad ones, the different ways that different groups of people think of nostalgia and how they use it differently. We'll be talking about race. We're talking about gender. We're talking about politics, all of these intersections with nostalgia, ways that we can look forward with this emotion, and even like a broader understanding of what what emotions are, and how we use them in our discourse. And so a nice nuanced understanding of it, and I guarantee you'll leave having learned something. And it's also, I'm going to teach it in very plain, accessible language. I've had a few questions about, like, do I need to have background in philosophy? Absolutely not. So it's designed for anybody to jump in, to onboard quickly, and to be able to follow along.
Yes, and I'll just say too is that, like, I know some people might be waiting for financial reasons, but please don't wait. The sooner that you can get into the class, the better. It helps the instructors get set up, get coordinated with their students, lets us know how we're doing in terms of signaling and getting the message out about the Acid Horizon Research Commons. And also, if you're kind of on the fence about like whether or not to join this course, know that it helps us develop what we are doing here on the podcast, allows us to take things to the next step. But for you too, you are going to have lifetime access to these recordings, and you can rest assured that once we get the Acid Horizon Research Commons moving along, that you, as those who started out with us with our very, very first course, will be afforded some privilege when it comes to future courses being offered. So I just wanted to put that out there, that your support, your contribution, and our collective willingness to go forward with this venture is going to bring about something that I think is going to be truly great, and allow us to not only reward people like Grafton, who've been, absolutely crucial at, like certain points in the history of Acid Horizon, like when we had our struggles with our former publishers, Grafton was there with us. And we want to reward those kind of people in our community and give them a platform to do the things that they do best. So as we're wrapping up here, just hop onto our website. I don't know if I can put it in the comments, but let me actually just do that. Will, maybe do you want to have a last word before we give Grafton the last word?
I guess I have a question. I wonder if one day people will be nostalgic for a particular epoch of Acid Horizon. you know, but other than that, I don't think I'll be too nostalgic for when people were washing their groceries. No.
That's right. And Grafton, any final words before we sign off for tonight?
No, I just want to thank you guys for having me on and getting to talk about the course, and I'm looking forward to it.
Great. And happy birthday to both Grafton and Will. And we'll see you guys again soon. I also let folks know that I have now my streaming setup is getting more solid and will become ever more solid. So I hope to do more streaming events in the future as well.
I've got the lighting now. You guys see that? Did everybody see that?
Look, no, I roll bisexual here, folks. Take a look at it. You see the
Thoroughly
pink and blue flying
bisexual.
in.
My lighting.
Yeah. No, we're solid over here.
We're solid.
All right. Great. Have a wonderful rest of your Sunday night, folks, and we'll see you next time.